Does it say recording for you guys in the corner?
Yes.
Okay.
So you guys started?
Yeah, I think we're affirmative. So
Okay, cool.
it's recording, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So I'll start. So as the atmosphere heats up, so should our urgency to adapt. My name is Mia, and my team believes that our nation needs to prioritize adaptation in order to create a better world, both on a local and global scale. In the middle of the pressing challenges of climate change, understanding the significance of embracing adaptive measures becomes important as we strive to help our Earth and the lives within our planet. So, I'll be talking about different adaptation strategies in the US and how that will benefit us economically, socially, and as far as globally. So, to begin, my first point is that through adaptation, we can help the economy of our nation. So, although adaptation strategies may be expensive, their benefits do not end with just helping our planet. This is explained in a recent intergovernmental panel on climate change. And some examples of the ways that adaptation strategies are multifunctional include that better building insulation mitigates energy use and all associated greenhouse gas emissions also improves adaptation by protecting us against heat and heat related illnesses. And another example is that more efficient use of water as we adapt to a drier world also yields benefits under current conditions of water scarcity. And another example is that locating infrastructure away from low-lying coastal areas provides adaptation to sea level rise and will protect us against tsunamis. So this proves that despite being expensive, the outcome outweighs the cost. And you may say that there are economic benefits to mitigating climate change. For example, that there will be an increase in jobs due to innovation in renewable energy sources. However, in the National Geographic website, an article that was published by Alejandra for Onda, in which she explains how, according to new research, warming has also had a measurable impact on economies, providing a boost to some countries and a penalty to others. And in most places that it hit harder, like the tropics, these countries that paid the highest price are least responsible for causing the problems, as they emit much less carbon dioxide per capita, like compared to richer countries. And so, from a moral standpoint, we owe it not only to our planet, but also to the less fortunate countries to start cleaning up our mess. And that begins with adapting. And so, secondly, my point is number two is that adaptation improves our society and encourages social equity in the world around us. So, climate resilient infrastructure can mitigate the impact of extreme weather events on communities, specifically those most impacted, which tend to be lower income areas, as I just talked about. And this includes building structures that can withstand floods, storms, and other climate related challenges. Infrastructure can reduce social disruptions caused by damage to homes, transportation systems, and utilities. Um, from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, multiple policymakers have stated that building climate resilient infrastructure can improve the reliability of service provision, increase asset life, and protect asset returns. And they've also stated that building climate resilience can involve a package of management measures, such as changing maintenance schedules and including adaptive management to account for uncertainty in the future. So, by mitigating climate change, we're not preparing for the uncertainty of the rising global temperatures, but by taking the efforts now and taking adaptive measures as such will account for the unpredictable like weather events that can be happening in the future. And climate change also sparks issues of social equity in communities. For example, from the US Climate Resilience Toolkit, during the devastating 1995 heat wave in Chicago, several low income neighborhoods that lacked air conditioning experienced some of the highest rates of mortality in the city. However, adaptation measures such as the Sustainable Development Plan put in place in New York City aim to combat the social inequality we have seen with the issue of climate change. According to the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, the plan aims to improve the city's physical infrastructure, economy, and quality of life while reducing its contributions to climate change and enhancing its resilience to climate change impacts. The effort incorporates social justice by acknowledging the need to assist lower income communities so they're able to participate fully in like climate change adaptation as well. So by implementing adaptation strategies, our societies will benefit as a whole, both in like the way that the like transportation and homes will all be safer from like the rising temperatures and also the social equity. And my last point is that on a global scale, climate change adaptation will improve public health. So, adapting to climate change can have significant implications for global public health. Measures to address heat waves, changing disease patterns, and other climate related health risks can benefit populations worldwide. International collaboration in health research and the sharing of best practices can enhance global resilience to climate related health threats. In an article published by the World Health Organization that was contributed to by multiple authors reveals that 3.6 billion people already live in areas highly susceptible to climate change. And despite contributing minimally to global emissions, low income countries and small island developing states endure the harshest health impacts. In vulnerable regions, that the death rate from extreme weather events in the last decade was 15 times higher than in less vulnerable ones. So fighting against climate change is not only going to directly help out these so fighting climate change is not going to directly help out these suffering people now in the present, but taking adaptive measures will. So to conclude, economic arguments may present challenges in the impact of climate change strategies. The need for adaptive measures remains not only crucial, but also beneficial in areas that expand beyond climate change adaptation. As we've explored, the social benefits of such efforts extend beyond economic considerations, but also include the resilience, well-being, and the equity of communities worldwide. So by investing in climate resilient infrastructure and addressing public health challenges on a global scale, we will be prepared for an uncertain future and also are offering real solutions to the pressing issues faced by vulnerable populations. If we acknowledge economic, social, and global dimensions, we can forge a sustainable path forward in the face of the climate crisis through adaptation.
I have a couple questions. So would it be like up to the individual to adapt, or would there be like government intervention to kind of like help these lower income communities adapt?
Yeah, so I think it's more of like the government and specifically more like states passing different like laws and acts like the plan in New York City that like aim to like help like put in adaptation measures in place and focus on the low income communities to make sure that they were getting like the right resources needed to like be able to adapt to the changing climate and like keep them safe and healthy. So I don't think it's necessarily the individual, it has to be like government policies being put in place.
Okay, and one more question. You talked about like the flooding and like island nations and how they're at most risk. Will adapting stop the flooding, or does that just essentially just move them out of their home because it's too dangerous to live there?
I think that definitely mitigation and adaptation go hand in hand. So like mitigation efforts to stop flooding are also important, but I think priorities should be like, yeah, moving them out of their homes or like further away from like the coastal areas where like the sea levels are rising because that's what's leading to the flooding. So I think being able to like figure out like relocation plans to like keep these people safe that like will like lose their home as like sea levels continue to rise.
Cool. That's all my questions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think I'm up for my team. All right, mine's not going to be that long, but yeah. All right. Firstly, mitigation strikes at the root of the problem. It's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, and embracing sustainable practices across industries. By mitigating climate change, we're not just treating the symptoms, we're addressing the underlying cause. This proactive approach is akin to preventing a fire rather than costs consistently battling the flames. Secondly, the cost of inaction is staggering. While adaptation measures are necessary, they come at a high price, both economically and socially. From building seawalls to relocating entire communities, adaptation requires substantial resources. In contrast, investing in mitigation now can yield significant long-term savings by averting the worst impacts of climate change. Moreover, mitigation fosters innovation and collaboration. It spurs technology advancements, creates green jobs, and encourages international cooperation. By leading the transition to a low carbon future, we not only safeguard the planet for future generations, but also position ourselves at the forefront of a burgeoning green economy. But say we were to adapt to climate change, would we just care about ourselves and let the other species on this planet deal with the bad we've committed? Why should they have to suffer because of what we've done? This is why we need to mitigate climate change and not adapt so we can save other species, including ourselves. But perhaps most importantly, mitigation is about justice. Climate change disproportionately affects the most vulnerable among us. The marginalized communities, the impoverished nations, and countless species with whom we share this planet. By mitigating climate change, we honor our moral obligation to safeguard the well-being of all beings and ensure a more equitable world for generations to come. In conclusion, the choice between mitigation and adaptation is clear. While adaptation can be future necessary, mitigation offers a path forward that is not only more effective and cost efficient, but also more ethical and just. Yeah, that's it. It's a little short, but.
Okay, so I think I'm asking a question. So my first question is, you mentioned how like mitigation is more of a long-term strategy, like addressing the root cause. So even though like it may be expensive to put in like adaptation measures like this, like relocating communities, don't you think that should be priority? Because like else what are we going to do with those people who are facing climate change's effects right now?
Like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. But I don't know. I mean, yes, like you said, and I said, adapting is really expensive. But at the end of the day, if we're adapting and we're putting in these measures, I don't feel like we're really helping the root of the problem. We're kind of just still letting global warming happen, and we're kind of just being selfish in a way by not um, caring about these other species on this planet. Um, so, I mean, I think both can be really, really helpful in the future. I just don't really see, I mean, if we were to adapt, I don't know what happens to the other species, and other species help our food source, are just a bunch of things in general, like ecosystems. So, I mean, yeah, they both could be like beneficial in the future, but I mean, thinking about the bigger picture, I don't know. I just think mitigation may be the option.
So to help these other species that you're saying are more vulnerable, like what mitigation strategies like do you think could be put in place like that would be less like costly than adaptation strategies?
I mean, we've tried this in the past. I mean, it just hasn't really worked. It's like use renewable energy or use electric cars, stuff like that. Reducing your carbon footprint. Um, all these sorts of different strategies can help. It's just really if we can get people to do it, that's really just the main problem we're trying to focus on. But there are a bunch of strategies such as electric cars, renewable energy, reducing our carbon footprint by walking to work or stuff like that. Taking action with the huge factories that are emitting CO2 into our atmosphere. Just a bunch of different things. It's just really if we can get people to do it.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, I think it's my turn now. Okay. Climate change is having profound effects on our world, and sitting back and waiting for large-scale mitigation efforts to take effect is not going to have any progress in helping people survive in our changing world. We can see the effects of climate change in our everyday lives and especially see the effect on vulnerable communities who are not receiving the support that they need. A 2023 article from the Environmental Protection Agency says that certain groups are more vulnerable than others to the health impacts of climate change due to social and economic factors like income, education, healthcare access, and housing. Adaptation is so important because of people's resistance to contributing to large-scale mitigation efforts. Extreme weather events are also having large impacts on our world, and we need to learn to adapt to our changing environment rather than being overly optimistic about mitigation efforts being able to stop what is already happening. Given the polarized state of our world, getting people on board with mitigation efforts that would actually make a positive impact on the environment is just not realistic. As much as we like to think that everyone cares about climate change, that is just not the reality. According to research done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication in 2023, only 64% of Americans are worried about climate change. This study also highlights that only 46% of Americans believe that global warming will harm them personally. From this research, we can conclude that despite the efforts of politicians and scientists to convince Americans that climate change is happening and will have profound effects on everyone's lives in the future, many Americans still do not believe that it is an immediate threat to them. This research shows that mitigation is just not feasible in our polarized world. For large-scale mitigation efforts to take place and have a real impact, people would have to significantly change their lifestyles. This includes drastically changing their diet in regards to meat consumption, changing their transportation and energy use strategies, and so much more. According to research published in 2022 by the University of Bonn, rich countries such as the United States would have to cut meat consumption by at least 75% in order to keep global climate goals in reach. Global meat consumption has quadrupled since between 1961 and 2019, according to a study done by the National Library of Medicine in 2019. These statistics show that we are not at all on track to cut meat consumption by the amount needed to help mitigate climate change, based on how meat consumption is just getting greater and greater over time. This means that we need to focus on adaptation strategies for climate change, since it appears that getting people to significantly change their diets to be more sustainable for the environment is not feasible. Many people believe that climate change is not a threat to them personally, so it is not their responsibility to do anything about it. If people don't believe climate change is a real threat, how can we expect them to get on board with helping mitigate climate change at their own expense? Focusing on adaptation means making progress now rather than waiting on people to make a change that appears is not going to happen anytime soon. Climate change has also had an extreme effect on our weather patterns in recent years. According to an article about climate change indicators published by the Environmental Protection Agency, scientific studies indicate that extreme weather events such as heat waves and large storms are likely to become more frequent or more intense with human-induced climate change. This research also explains how warmer average temperatures could contribute to the spread of diseases, an increase in deaths among vulnerable populations, and damage to crops. Because average temperatures are going to keep rising and mitigation efforts are unlikely to have a noticeable impact on our climate within the next couple of decades or so, these extreme weather events are going to continue and likely get worse. We must learn how to adapt to the consequences they will have on our communities instead of just waiting for them to stop on their own when that is just not realistic. Research from the Columbia Climate School in 2022 provides many ideas for how we can adapt to our changing weather patterns. For example, we need to develop private and publicly subsidized systems of insurance that pay the cost of reconstruction after disasters occur. Schools, libraries, water, transportation, waste, and sewage infrastructure also need to be made more weatherproof and eligible for federal reconstruction grants. An example of how our cities can be more prepared for extreme weather events is to install better draining pavement to reduce the impact of flooding. Of course, altering our infrastructure to prepare for extreme weather is costly, but the money that is lost from the damage caused by these events is much greater. If we can prevent as much harm as possible from happening in the first place, the damage and recovery costs after these events take place will be much lower. With the rate at which climate change is affecting our world, we cannot do much to prevent these extreme weather events from happening. However, we can control how we prepare and how we respond in order to have the least destructive result as possible. Yes, mitigation strategies should not be ignored, but because of the impacts that climate change is having on our world right now, right in front of our faces, we have to learn how to adapt to this new world. People all around the world are already dying from climate change's effects. For example, the United Nations reported that over the last half century, over 2 million deaths have been caused by extreme weather events. If we are too optimistic about the success of mitigation strategies, we will miss out on all the help we can provide to people right now through adaptation. People will also be more willing to contribute to adaptation rather than mitigation because it allows us to see immediate progress. It is hard to get people on board with something that they aren't going to see make a significant difference for decades down the line. Especially with how divided our country is on these big issues like climate change, we will likely have more success with focusing on short-term solutions than long-term solutions. According to a study done by the Pew Research Center in 2021, only 6 in 10 US adults believe that they are concerned, they say that they are concerned that global climate change will harm them personally. Adaptation and mitigation are both strategies that require cooperation and participation from the public. From the research showing that many Americans don't believe climate change is an immediate threat, it is more reasonable to focus on adaptation strategies where people can see immediate action being taken. It is naive to think that society will band together for the greater good. Mitigation strategies may not even be effective if we can't get people to change their lifestyles to benefit the cause. However, adaptation can benefit us socially, economically, and allow us to see real change in keeping people healthy and safe in our changing environment.
All right. I have two questions. The first one is, do you have any specific ways of adaptation strategies that would like address the increasing, how to say this, frequency of like extreme weather events, like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my speech, there's like a lot of different research on how these adaptation strategies can take place. For example, like a specific example is a lot of people talk about how better draining pavement can be installed in cities and neighborhoods and stuff like that so that the effects of flooding aren't as intense. And one of the biggest adaptation strategies is just to weatherproof buildings and cities so that they're not as easily damaged by these hurricanes, tornadoes, and stuff like that. And yeah, so basically weatherproofing and just improving our infrastructure overall so that it can withstand these extreme weather events.
Okay. So like those measures that you guys are going to take for adapting, it sounds like it's probably going to be costly. And the USA is already $34 trillion in debt. So where would this money come from?
There are a lot of different places that we feel like the money can come from, like reallocating funds in the government from certain things to put them more towards climate efforts. And I think like both in mitigation and adaptation, there's a lot that needs to be talked about, like where the funds can come from. And like both for mitigation, I feel like you could ask the same question, like mitigation is going to be very costly and where would those funds come from? But yeah, I think just reallocating funds like in the government to put it towards climate change because obviously more money needs to be put towards it as it gets worse over time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Jack Billings. I'm the second speaker for the negative team, and I'm here to tell you why the US should prioritize climate mitigation over adaptation efforts. So, in reality, we can only adapt for so long until we need the temperatures to stop rising. Adaptation means anticipating the adverse effects of climate change and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause, but not stopping any of the problems. So we would just continually be spending money on adapting as the climate continues to worsen without actually fixing anything. These can be expensive, and authorities like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change agree that some carbon removal will be needed to head off the worst climate change scenarios before like adapting will actually do anything. And examples include lowering the carbon footprint, switching to electric vehicles, and preserving forests to absorb carbon dioxide. Some other effective carbon absorbing systems are the HFC, HVAC management, and wind turbines. These solutions were modeled in a plausible scenario to reduce or sequester over 1,051 gigatons of carbon by 2050. And we were talking about expenses, and I was thinking that maybe like a carbon tax. Our group talked about a carbon tax in previous debates, and a carbon tax could decrease greenhouse emissions by 14% through a $15 per ton tax on CO2 emissions, and this wouldn't be affecting the lower income or even just like the Commonwealth of America, because the average person doesn't really produce a ton of carbon, but it's more based towards the like corporations that are producing all of these climate changes. By increasing the share of renewable energies or establishing a cleaner mobility system or enhancing the storage of these gases, mitigation is a human intervention that reduces the sources of emissions and enhances the sinks. So we're actually going to the root problem and fixing the thing that is changing the environment. We're not just adapting to continually worsening conditions. And the sooner the world stops the rise of greenhouse gases and shields people from the warming we have already caused, the less we will ultimately have to spend to stabilize our climate. And I think that's about it. That's all I got.
Okay, so I just have a couple questions. My first one is, do you think that it's possible to get people on board with strategies to mitigate climate change, given how polarized our country is over the issue?
I think so, but I also think that adaptation and mitigation need to work hand in hand. I'm not saying that we could just fight this problem with only mitigation or only adaptation, but as a country, we need to prioritize the end to these rising temperatures so we don't have to just keep throwing money at like fixing streets and redoing buildings so they could survive hurricane after hurricane. We need to stop these climate fluctuations, I guess.
Okay. My second question is, if we're only focusing on mitigating, then what should we do about what's happening to us right now, like with extreme weather and things like that?
Like I said, I think it has to be like a dual effort. So, I mean, mitigating or adapting will buy us time so we can eventually end the problem with mitigation.
Okay.
That's the best
And
way.
then my last question is that since it's been proven that 2023 was the hottest year on record, if this pattern continues, do you think we should just ignore it or start planning for how to live in these new conditions?
I think we need to start planning on how we can stop the climate from getting hotter than it was in 2023. I mean, if we adapt to how hot it is now, which we do eventually, or we do need to do, we can't just mitigate it, but we need to. Sorry, this is a good question.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's all the questions that I have. So thank you.
I think it's time for the rebuttal preparation time, so.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna just like mute and call on the phone. Are you guys cool with that? Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, we'll do the same thing. Thank you.
Let us know when you guys are ready.
We're ready.
Okay, so I think we go first. Okay. We can all agree that climate change is happening and both adaptation and mitigation are important. However, the US needs to prioritize adaptation because it can truly focus on mitigation strategies. By implementing large-scale mitigation strategies, we may face challenges stretching from technology to politics. By adapting, we can provide immediate benefits while also reducing our vulnerability to climate-related risks without needing to rely on the end of climate change, because realistically, that fight is going to take a significant amount of effort from people all around the world. Global cooperation on mitigation is difficult to achieve, and some countries may not agree to agreed upon targets. At the end of the day, we don't know the level of future emissions. Right now, we know that each year the planet is getting increasingly warmer, so our carbon emissions are increasing. There have been some efforts to combat climate change, but none of them have shown significantly effective since we're continually facing the impacts that the warming planet has on our world. By focusing on climate change adaptation, our world will be prepared even if mitigation efforts fall short. So your speaker stated that the high costs come with adaptation. However, I wanted to re-emphasize on a point that was previously stated by our team, that in the National Geographic article written by Alejandro, fighting against climate change has a measurable impact on economies and provides a boost to some countries, like you said, but it hits the places in tropics harder than others, who has to pay high prices and they're least responsible for causing the problem. So to conclude, we agree that mitigation efforts are necessary to limit the severity of climate change. Both adaptation and mitigation are crucial components in our strategy to address climate change. However, the focus on building resilience for adaptation should be the priority because it will help us deal with climate change effects right now. The rise in extreme weather events should urge us to start adapting. Thank you.
All right. I'm Maddie Bonder. I'm going to be the conclusion for the negative side. All right. Adaptation strategies are often short-term and reactionary. How can we ensure that they effectively address the root causes of climate change? Doesn't it seem that the US's efforts, resources, and funding and adaptation efforts push off the inevitable? How long can we continue to adapt to climate change? Shouldn't we focus on mitigation solutions that aim to eliminate and minimize the root causes of climate change? Aren't we looking for a more lasting impact? Jack gave us a quote from the Climate Reality Project that stuck with me, and I'd like to reiterate it to you all now. We can't adapt our way out of this situation, especially not with the absolutely unprecedented rate of change that we're seeing now. Truly solving the climate change crisis calls for mitigation. These mitigation strategies reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the causes of climate change through the efforts discussed, like switching over to renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and implementing policies to limit these carbon emissions, like a tax on carbon. Adaptation should not be prioritized over mitigation efforts because it only addresses the symptoms of climate change rather than its root causes, continuing the cycle of environmental damage. Adaptation is not economically sound because it does involve short-term fixes that require an ongoing investment without addressing these underlying causes. While adaptation may provide immediate relief, it lacks long-term sustainabilities and can incur high costs over time consistently. Additionally, the economic burden of adaptation falls disproportionately on marginalized communities, and it perpetuates social and economic disparities. Instead of investing solely on adaptation, if we prioritize mitigation efforts, we can find a more cost-effective and sustainable solutions that address the root causes and start from the inside out. Megan brought up the drastic changes that come with mitigation. But those changes are almost exactly parallel to the adaptation strategies you guys discussed. Isn't drastic change what we need? Adaptation is just rolling over and saying it is what it is. In no way is America adapting alone without putting in efforts to fight, taking responsibility for being the main cause of climate change. According to a NASA study in 2014 on climate change and mitigation, they described the goal of mitigation being to avoid significant human interference with the Earth's climate, also saying that we must stabilize greenhouse gases gas levels in a time frame sufficient enough to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to the climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable an economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Focusing on the big picture and fighting climate change will allow the environment to adapt naturally. As a society, we shouldn't put our efforts into adapting to a world where climate change is imminent, but adapt to a world where we educate others on the climate while making real changes to do what we can while we still have time. I believe that the audience and the judges can see that the US should focus on the mitigation strategies due to the environmental and economic benefits we discussed in this debate. And Ben concluded it best. While adaptation can be a future necessity, mitigation offers a path forward that is not only more effective and cost efficient, but is also more ethical and just. Thank you.
Okay,
done.
thanks, guys. Did
Yeah.
everybody get their recording?
Yes.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay,
Okay,
perfect.
thanks, guys.
Yep,
Yeah, good job.